What if humanity just stopped being straight? Not overnight, not because of war or technology, but slowly, mysteriously, one generation at a time. You wake up to headlines. Survey finds Gen Z nearly entirely queer. Straight teens no longer exist. Global sexuality shift, coincidence, or evolution? There's no law against straightness, no anti-straight agenda. Just a quiet vanishing. As if nature itself decided to remix the code of love, and nobody saw it coming. The realization doesn't come from labs or leaders. It begins with whispers in high schools and therapy rooms, until the world has no choice but to face it. It didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement, no scientific alert, just a slow dawning realization. Across the world, a new wave of teenagers began coming of age, and not a single one identified as straight. Some were openly queer. Some explored fluid attraction. Others didn't care for categories at all. But the pattern was clear. Traditional heterosexuality had quietly faded. At first, people assumed it was social experimentation, peer influence, rebellion. But then it kept going. Year after year, country after country, generation after generation. The data piled up. Surveys confirmed it. Counselors whispered about it. Parents began to panic. Religious leaders held emergency sermons, and still, not one straight teen. No one could explain it. But the evidence was undeniable. Humanity had crossed a threshold. Now, scientists scramble for answers, desperate to understand what flipped the switch in our biology, our behavior, or both. At first, the scientific community was dismissive. Sexuality, after all, had always been fluid to some degree. Researchers chalked it up to social change, generational identity, exploration, or even mass cultural influence. But then the numbers kept climbing. By the early 2040s, studies from over 50 countries revealed the same shocking trend. Less than 1% of individuals under 20 identified as straight, regardless of upbringing, religion, geography, or parental influence. That 1%, often misreported or later revised. Many of those individuals would eventually come out as queer in some form. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't political. It was biological. The search for an answer turned urgent. Scientists began exploring everything. Hormonal changes during pregnancy, environmental shifts affecting fetal development, neural rewiring during adolescence, genetic epigenetic markers that seemed newly activated in post-2020 birth cohorts. Some hypothesized that human evolution was naturally selecting for greater social cohesion and empathy, traits more commonly found across the LGBTQ+ spectrum when it came to forming relationships not strictly tied to reproduction. Others pointed to rising global stress levels, declining birth rates, and shifts in environmental chemicals as subtle nudges altering human development. Still others believed this wasn't evolution, but acceleration. A latent part of humanity suddenly flipping on. And yet, no single gene could be blamed. No virus, no mutation. Just a silent cascade of biological dominoes tipping toward one outcome. Straightness was fading, not by choice, but by design. Scientific communities fractured. Some declared it an evolutionary leap forward, nature unbinding humanity from the burden of reproduction, focused attraction. Others called for moral panic, accusing institutions of ignoring the dangers of social contagion or neglecting traditional values. The debates grew hostile. Papers were withdrawn. Researchers silenced. Even Nobel-level scientists found themselves blacklisted for suggesting sexuality could be part of a biological shift, not just a social trend. Behind closed doors, government panels convened. Private labs launched billion-dollar studies. One leaked UN report even hinted at a long, theorized adaptive shift gene, a genetic system that subtly rewires species. Wide behavior when population or planetary survival reaches a tipping point. That gene, if real, would have activated sometime around the late 2010s. By the time the mainstream media caught on, it was too late. A whole generation had already moved on, forming connections that defied outdated models of gender and attraction. They didn't need answers. They were already living the new reality. But while science scrambled for explanations, society was already reeling. Caught between celebration, confusion, and fear of what this meant for everything they thought was normal. The world didn't react with logic. It reacted with emotion. Raw, messy, explosive emotion. At first, the realization sparked confusion. Parents quietly asked their kids if they were sure. Faith leaders organized emergency seminars. Influencers uploaded panicked think pieces, trying to decode the trend. Governments issued NAN statements, hoping it was just another youth phase. But this wasn't a phase. This was a global reset. By the mid-2040s, surveys across North America, Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America all confirmed the same thing. A queer generation was growing up under the noses of a society still shaped by straight expectations. The backlash was instant. Conservative pundits flooded the airwaves with terms like identity, contagion, moral decay, and reverse grooming. Panic spread across parents' forums. Entire school boards resigned overnight. Some nations even launched traditional family reinforcement programs, but no matter how much money they threw at it, the kids didn't revert. They couldn't revert. There was nothing to revert to. This wasn't rebellion. This was redefinition. Cultural systems began to fracture. Media industries built around heterosexual storylines saw a drop in engagement. Teen romance dramas failed to resonate. Rom-com formulas flopped. Coming-of-age stories that didn't include a spectrum of identities felt ancient. Like black and white TV in a 4,000 world. Religious institutions faced internal schisms. Some denominations embraced the shift as divine fluidity. God's love has no label. Others dug deeper into dogma, issuing apocalyptic warnings and clinging to their dwindling congregations. Entire temples, mosques, and churches split in two, one half embracing inclusion, the other bracing for war. In the streets, protests broke out on both sides. Some carried rainbow flags and chanted, "Love is evolution." Others clung to signs reading, "Bring back the natural order." In classrooms, new curriculum was rushed into production. Sex education expanded, diversified, and unlearned its binary biases. History books were rewritten to include forgotten queer leaders, untold revolutions, and erased cultures that had embraced fluidity for centuries. Corporations scrambled to keep up. Advertising campaigns that once featured perfect nuclear families now spotlighted polycules, co-parenting networks, and queer partnerships across the spectrum. Brands who faked inclusivity got called out fast. This generation could smell performative allyship from a mile away. And then came the unexpected challenge. Older generations were being left behind. Parents didn't know how to relate to their kids. Mentorship programs collapsed as shared experiences grew too different. Politicians who ran on family values couldn't even define what family meant anymore. It wasn't just awkward, it was cultural whiplash. But amidst the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Acceptance wasn't just demanded, it became expected. Teenagers created micro-communities where labels were loose. Love was exploratory. And emotional honesty reigned over tradition. Friendships blurred into relationships. Relationships shifted into platonic life partnerships, and coming out eventually became obsolete. There was no closet to come out of. There was no norm to compare to. Queerness had become the norm. In that sense, culture didn't collapse. It evolved. And with love no longer defined by opposites. Humanity had to rewrite the rules of connection, starting with how relationships even work. With the collapse of heterosexual expectations came the birth of a new romantic frontier. Dating wasn't dead. It was just unrecognizable. In the old world, romance operated on scripts. Boy meets girl. Opposites attract. Marriage equals success. Children equal purpose. But in this future, those scripts were tossed in the fire, burned not out of anger, but irrelevance. Teenagers no longer saw gender as a requirement for attraction. They formed connections based on emotional depth, intellectual compatibility, shared values, or simply vibes. Flirtation became more fluid. Labels like boyfriend, girlfriend, or even partner were replaced with new terms. Relationship codes that were unique to every couple, trio, or collective. Love was no longer defined by what it should be. It was defined by what it could be. Romantic relationships became more emotionally intelligent. In the absence of rigid gender roles, people became better communicators. They asked questions. They set boundaries early. They explored emotions without shame. Masculinity softened. Femininity expanded. Androgyny became a norm rather than an exception. Hookup culture didn't vanish, but it matured. Consent became ritualized. Emotional check-ins were normalized. Sex wasn't taboo. It was treated like any other human experience. Important, personal, and diverse. Monogamy still existed, but it was no longer the assumed destination. Polyamory found space to breathe, not as rebellion, but as preference. Some people dated in small groups. Others entered lifelong partnerships that were romantic, but not sexual. Or sexual, but not romantic. Or committed, but not exclusive. The idea that one person must fulfill every emotional, sexual, and social need became outdated. Instead, people built relationship ecosystems, multiple connections that together formed a whole. This didn't mean chaos, it meant honesty. Dating apps evolved. Filters expanded beyond male and female. People searched for emotional safety, shared spiritual values, or open communication styles. Algorithms learned how to match based on goals rather than identity. Weddings changed too. Gone were the tux and dress binaries. Vows were rewritten to reflect chosen dynamics. I promise to support your freedom. I choose you today, and I will keep choosing you. Ceremonies included multiple partners, or no legal paperwork at all. Some looked more like art installations than official unions, celebrating love in its raw, infinite forms. And in this future, love was uncoupled from reproduction. No one dated to settle down and start a family. That wasn't the pressure anymore. Children weren't the prize at the end of a romantic timeline. They were a choice, pursued intentionally, regardless of partnership. This freedom came with challenges. People had to define their own expectations. Relationships required more self-awareness, more courage, and more communication than ever before. There was no script to hide behind, no social checklist to follow, only people, choosing each other. Day by day, and for many, that was terrifying. The old system, flawed as it was, at least gave people a path to follow. Now, relationships were a labyrinth. It's beautiful, wild, personal, but full of uncertainty. Therapists became vital. Communication courses boomed. A new profession emerged: relationship architects. Trained guides who helped people design and navigate the unique dynamics of their chosen love lives. But for all its complexity, one truth remained. Love had never been this honest. It had never been this free. And if love no longer needs a blueprint, then what happens to the very structure that once depended on it? Family. Once love shed its labels, family followed. For centuries, family had been synonymous with a straight couple, a few kids, and a shared last name. But in this new world, that image felt like an antique. Beautiful to some, irrelevant to most. In the absence of straightness, reproduction no longer followed biology, followed intention. Parenthood became a choice, not an expectation. No one felt pressure to marry by 30, have 2 kids by 35, and struggle to make it work. Instead, raising a child required proactive planning, whether it was through surrogacy, adoption, IVF, sperm donation, or synthetic gestation. And while the science of childbirth evolved, so did the structure of parenting. No longer confined to mom and dad, family units diversified. 2 dads and a co-parenting best friend. A group of 4 long-term partners raising a child as a collective. A single parent supported by a chosen village of friends. Entire co-housing communities sharing childcare across dozens of families. Biological ties didn't hold the same weight they used to. Emotional bonds were the new DNA. Blood relatives became just one way to define family, often not the most important. The idea of chosen family rose to the forefront. People weren't born into families anymore, they built them, and legal systems scrambled to catch up. Marriage laws were already outdated, but now parental rights entered uncharted territory. Who counted as a legal guardian in a tri-parent household? Could 3 people sign a birth certificate? What happened during a breakup? Did custody split 3 ways? Family courts had to be restructured from the ground up. New terms were introduced: parental clusters, emotional custody, domestic nesting partnerships, rotating parenting pods. And as family definitions changed, so did the economy. Traditional children often relied on one parent working while the other stayed home. In this new reality, shared financial responsibility across multi-parent units became normal. Communal parenting meant fewer children in isolation, more access to support, and greater mental health for everyone involved. The nuclear family was no longer the goal. It was just one of many blueprints. Meanwhile, education shifted to reflect these new realities. Classroom materials evolved to acknowledge various family types. Instead of "draw your mommy and daddy," children were asked, "Who's in your care circle? Who loves you and helps you?" Grow. Teachers were trained to support kids with 3 parents or 5. Mother's Day and Father's Day were replaced with Family Day, a celebration of love, care, and connection, no matter the gender, biology, or configuration. And then came the unexpected silver lining. Kids thrived. Studies showed children raised in diverse family systems often had higher emotional intelligence, better conflict resolution skills, and a stronger sense of personal identity. Why? Because they grew up knowing love wasn't confined to 2 roles or rigid norms. They learned that care was something people chose to give, not something biology demanded. Of course, not everyone was on board. There were still regions, institutions, and ideologies clinging to the old model. But their influence was shrinking, drowned out by the lived reality of millions of people who no longer saw family as fixed. In this world, you didn't need to be straight to have a home, raise a child, or grow old surrounded by love. You just needed people who showed up. But as families redefined themselves and love expanded its boundaries, the real battleground moved elsewhere, into the institutions that once dictated what was acceptable. For centuries, politics had operated under one assumption: the straight. Nuclear family was the foundation of civilization. Now, that foundation had crumbled, and the system wasn't ready for the rebuild. As more of the population identified across the queer spectrum, policies built for a heteronormative society began to rot at the roots. Marriage laws, healthcare benefits, inheritance rights, tax brackets, child custody rules, all built around the assumption of one man and one woman. Governments faced a choice: evolve fast or collapse slowly. Some countries led the charge. Progressive democracies passed sweeping reforms: legal recognition of multi-partner relationships, equal access to fertility technology for all identities, parental rights for non-biological co-parents, gender neutral legal documentation. Even formerly conservative nations, feeling the economic and cultural pressure, began to revise their constitutions. New departments were formed: Ministry of Domestic Rights, Office of Family Diversity, Council on Relationship Recognition. But not everyone moved forward. Traditionalist regimes dug in their heels. It declared the queer shift a threat to national identity. In some areas, crackdowns escalated. New laws passed that criminalized non-traditional family structures. State-run schools doubled down on straight-first teachings. Protests were met with violence. International sanctions followed. What emerged was a new geopolitical fault line: queer majority nations versus hetero, supremacist holdouts. Trade alliances broke down. Visas were restricted. A global migration boom began, not because of war or famine, but for the right to live openly. This modern exodus reshaped borders. Entire cities transformed into queer havens, safe zones where people could marry, co-parent, and express identity without fear. Some cities adopted new charters altogether, branding themselves as post-label municipalities. In politics, queer representation exploded. Parliaments that had once had one token seat were now majority queer. New parties rose, not centered on left or right, but on fluidity versus rigidity. Campaign slogans shifted. Vote for visibility, policy for all partnerships. No one left out of the law. But representation alone wasn't enough. Laws had to be rewritten. From scratch, constitutional amendments were drafted to decouple marriage from religion. Healthcare systems were overhauled to include transition services, non-gendered medical protocols, and parental leave for all caregivers, regardless of gender or genetic connection. Religious institutions faced a reckoning. Many adapted, opening doors, updating liturgy, revising doctrines. A few went further, crafting entirely new spiritual philosophies centered on universal love, emotional fluidity, and connection beyond binaries. Others chose extinction. Attendance dropped. Scandals emerged. The institutions that couldn't evolve were left behind. Meanwhile, education policy saw revolution. Curricula were no longer just inclusive, they were reflective. History was retold through queer perspectives. Philosophy classes debated the ethics of monogamy, chosen family, and identity construction. Gender studies became core classes, not electives. And teachers trained to support emotional development as much as academic growth. But power always resists change. New threats emerged. Neo-traditionalist coalitions lobbying for return to structure policies. Corporate lobbying groups attempting to exploit queer culture for branding without real support. Political parties trying to divide queer communities by prioritizing certain identities over others. To resist, the public had to stay alert. Grassroots activism remained vital. Digital communities organized boycotts, protests, and global walkouts when legislation threatened their freedom. And yet, despite the noise, the trend was clear. Governments weren't leading the people. They were catching up. This wasn't a political agenda. It was a demographic inevitability. When society changes from the ground up, institutions don't get to decide whether to follow, only how gracefully they do it. And as the world rewrote its laws and redrew its borders, one question still lingered. Can identity exist in a world where every label is blurred? At some point, it became clear. The labels we'd once clung to, gay, straight, bi, pan, male, female, weren't just outdated, they were irrelevant. When queerness became the majority, identity stopped being about difference. It became about expression, and the language we use to describe ourselves. It had to evolve or be left behind. Pronouns were the first to shift. He and she remained, but were no longer assumed. Singular, they became standard in schools, workplaces, even government IDs. New pronouns, like Z, Phi, and custom-designed sets, entered mainstream usage. Not just for gender, but for relationship dynamics, emotional roles, even sexual openness. Some people had rotating pronouns. Others identified with none at all. And for the first time in human history, it wasn't considered confusing. It was just part of the conversation. Labels collapsed under their own weight. What did gay mean when everyone was queer? What did straight mean when no one was? What did woman or man even signify when your identity didn't depend on biology or permanence? Language didn't disappear. It multiplied. People used identity maps, digital templates, or personal diagrams showing how they navigated emotional, sexual, and romantic energy. Some shared theirs publicly like social media bios. Others treated them like love languages, revealed only in moments of trust. Dating apps abandoned checkboxes. Instead, users matched through intention mapping. I'm seeking emotional intimacy, light physical connection, and creative partnership. Or, I'm not seeking anything serious, but open to fluid experiences. And yet, there was a paradox. In a world where anything could be an identity, did anything still hold meaning? The queer majority began to feel the weight of hyperfluidity. Without clear terms, some people felt lost. What used to help people find their tribe now felt like a blur of endless categories. Anxiety rose. Young people sometimes cycled through 10 different labels in a year, trying to find what fit. There were cries to bring back the basics, not as regression, but as anchors in a world where everything felt shapeless. In response, a new movement emerged, the identity simplifiers. They didn't reject queerness. They embraced it, while streamlining the language. Don't ask who I am, their motto went. Ask how I love. Others doubled down on label creativity. They invented new lexicons, full of symbols, colors, and hybrid words. Entire online communities formed around identity sculpting, the art of building a new label that fits only you. Language became a kind of art. Dynamic, personal. Evolving, this evolution spread into media and storytelling. Characters weren't defined by orientation. They were defined by experience. A single protagonist might explore a relationship with a male, identifying partner in one arc, then develop a deep romantic friendship with a non-binary creative in another. And it wasn't a twist. It was normal. Children's programming reflected this shift early. Cartoons, books, and games featured families of all configurations and characters that changed pronouns mid-story without explanation. Because the new generation didn't need explanation. They needed representation. But just as queer identity stopped being subversive, something strange happened. Old labels became artifacts. Straight became a historical footnote. Coming out became an outdated ritual. Even queer felt strange, because how do you define queerness when there's nothing left to contrast it? Some held on to these words like heirlooms. Others let them go with gratitude, like the training wheels of a society learning to balance. And yet, without labels, without binaries, without a path to follow, humans began to ask deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and the soul itself. With the collapse of rigid identities came a spiritual silence. Not rejection, not rebellion, just stillness. The old ways no longer fit. Religions built around binary genders, heterosexual unions, and divine hierarchies began to feel distant. Like radio stations playing in a language no one spoke anymore. And so, people turned inward. They didn't abandon spirituality. They reconstructed it. Faith systems underwent a metamorphosis. In place of gods who commanded, new philosophies emerged centered around energy, connection, and shared presence. Where once sacred texts drew lines between man and woman, sinner and saved, now teachings focused on emotional alignment, universal empathy, and fluid consciousness. The most radical shift. Divinity was no longer above. It was within. People no longer asked, "Who does God want me to be?" They asked, "What version of myself resonates with the world today?" In this world, queer spirituality flourished. Not as a rebellion against tradition, but as a natural evolution of it. New spiritual spaces blossomed. Temples designed without pews or pulpits, just circular rooms for shared reflection. Meditation networks that used voice, movement, and collective breathwork rather than doctrine, digital prayer gardens. AR spaces where users could offer intentions, gratitude, and energy to a shared field of consciousness. Ceremonies shifted from rigid rituals to personalized rites of passage. Coming of awareness, celebrations, first identity, circle gatherings, partnership offerings between more than two souls. Guided by poetry and intention rather than vows. And yet, amid the beauty, a philosophical crisis emerged. Without the framework of heaven, hell, sin, or salvation, what did life mean? With no right way to live, no model to follow, no afterlife reward to strive for, some began to feel unmoored. Was everything just a matter of choice? Were morals still absolute? Was anything sacred? A new wave of philosophers rose. They weren't robe-wearing sages or tenured professors. They were artists, community builders, technologists. People who asked hard questions and offered new narratives. What if purpose isn't fixed, but chosen? What if souls are real, but not gendered? What if divinity is experienced in emotional resonance, not obedience? These ideas sparked schools of thought, like emotism, the belief that shared emotional experience is the highest spiritual act, soul refracting, the theory that one consciousness can express through infinite gender and identity combinations across time. Loop ethics, a morality model that values the cyclical impact of actions rather than linear consequences. Even quantum physics joined the conversation. Theories about consciousness affecting matter aligned surprisingly well with the fluidity culture had embraced. Some scientists and mystics began collaborating, hosting hybrid symposiums where meditation and particle physics coexisted. This era became known as the Great Integration, not of religion and science, but of identity and spirit. Children were no longer taught what to believe. They were guided to ask, "What feels true to you today?" And that truth was allowed to change. There were still those who clung to older systems. Not out of malice, but nostalgia. They found comfort in structure, meaning in the familiar. And in this new world, that was allowed too, so long as it didn't harm others. That was the quiet rule of this age. Live your truth, not at the expense of another's. In that space, grace became universal. Not something granted by a deity, but something people gave each other. And while belief systems evolved, the human heart still wrestled with age. Old questions in a world free from shame. What does it feel like to live and love without fear? In a world without straightness, without rigid expectations, without shame, you might expect humanity to be happier. And in many ways, it was. But with liberation came a new emotional frontier, one filled with freedom. Yes, but also complexity. Gone were the days of suppressing identity to fit in. There was no longer a fear of coming out. No closets, no masks. Children grew up seeing themselves reflected everywhere, on screens, in schools, at home. Mental health outcomes among queer youth soared. Fewer suicides, less anxiety about identity. Higher self, acceptance, a deep sense of belonging from an early age. Therapists, for the first time in modern history, reported hope as a dominant emotional theme in adolescent counseling. But something else surfaced too, a strange kind of emotional fatigue. Freedom without structure can feel like chaos. When everything is allowed, how do you choose? When identity is infinite, how do you anchor yourself? Many struggled with what psychologists began calling identity overstimulation, a condition where the pressure to constantly define, redefine, and personalize your existence became overwhelming. Not everyone wanted to be fluid all the time. Some just wanted to be, without questioning every impulse or preference. There was also the paradox of limitless acceptance. When society accepts everyone, being different no longer makes you special. For decades, queerness had been a badge of resilience. Now, it was just expected. Some people, especially in their 20s and 30s, began experiencing what was called queer burnout, a kind of emotional exhaustion from constantly managing relationships without familiar scripts. From navigating conversations that used to be playful but now felt heavy with meaning. from being seen but still not always understood. Loneliness didn't disappear. It changed shape. In the old world, queer people were often isolated by rejection. In this new one, people could feel isolated by ambiguity. What did intimacy mean when definitions shifted daily? How did you build deep trust when your partner's pronouns, boundaries, or desires might evolve by the next full moon? In response, new emotional skill sets became essential. Boundary articulation, real-time identity, syncing, dynamic empathy, self-reflection without shame. Emotional literacy became the new literacy. Children learned how to name their feelings before they learned multiplication. Teenagers attended empathy workshops as part of their standard curriculum. Couples, groups, and solo individuals saw relationship coaches regularly, not as crisis intervention, but maintenance. Mental health was no longer stigmatized. It was optimized. Therapy apps boomed. Emotional tracking tools became as common as fitness watches. Public spaces, like libraries, parks, even malls, offered emotional recharge zones where people could decompress, reflect, and ground themselves. Still, not everything could be solved with mindfulness. Grief persisted. So did heartbreak. So did the ache of not being chosen or not being seen. What changed was the language around pain. It wasn't pathologized, it was honored. Heartbreak was taught as a rite of passage. Loneliness was seen as a signal, not a failure. Discomfort was treated as a teacher. And in this world where emotional fluidity was the norm, people didn't avoid hard feelings. They leaned into them, together. Communities organized feeling feasts where people gathered to cry, vent, scream, or sit in silence. There were no solutions, just solidarity. Because even in a future without repression, being human still hurts sometimes. But here's the difference. In this world, you didn't have to hide it. You didn't have to perform. You didn't have to explain why. You were allowed to be messy. You were allowed to not know. You were allowed to say, "I'm still figuring it out." And instead of being met with judgment, you were met with understanding. So now the question isn't what do we become without straightness? It's what kind of future do we create with all this freedom? Now that love is no longer bound by fear. There was no single moment when the world changed. No switch flipped. No decree declared. It just shifted. One generation at a time. One child at a time. One unspoken truth at a time. Until one day, we woke up in a world where heterosexuality wasn't outlawed. It was simply gone. Like cassette tapes. Like rotary phones. Like blueprints for a house no one lived in anymore. But in its place, something astonishing bloomed. Not just tolerance, it's not just inclusion, but redefinition. We didn't just change who we loved. We changed how we related, how we parented, how we governed, how we believed, and most of all, how we understood ourselves. The loss of straightness didn't fracture society. It freed it from assumptions, from binaries, from inherited rules no one remembered agreeing to. And yet, it wasn't utopia. There were struggles. There were stumbles. There were people who longed for the simplicity of before, even if it came with pain. But in this new world, love was no longer a box to fit into. It was a horizon, endless, expanding, and as diverse as the people who carried it. So what happens when straight disappears? Life goes on. Differently. Honestly. Beautifully. And maybe, just maybe. Just maybe. What we called straight was never the default to begin with, just a story we told ourselves, until we were ready to write a new one. If this made you see the future differently, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more wild what-if worlds that challenge everything you thought was normal.